Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to The Trust Makers.
Hi, I'm Justin Blake, the Executive Director of the Edelman Trust Institute. I'm joined by Margaret Talev, a journalist and the inaugural director of the Syracuse University Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship. Margaret has spent her career covering American politics, including as a White House correspondent. Now, she is a senior contributor at Axios and a frequent analyst at CNN. At Syracuse, Margaret oversees the Institute's study of eroding civil discourse, democratic engagement, and trust in government and journalism. Margaret, welcome to the Trust Makers.
Justin, thank you so much.
The Syracuse University Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship just launched this year. Tell us about why it was created.
You're right. We are just launching this year, and really our program is set to get underway this fall. But the idea of this came together really formally after the January 6th attacks. And it was to say, look, we're at a crossroads in this country where the intersection of democracy and journalism matter, and people's understanding of fact versus conspiracy theory, of where to get good information versus misinformation. All of this has already been important for a long time, but now it's come into focus with this crisis. And our university has a unique role to play because Syracuse includes two of the most prominent programs in the country, the Maxwell School for Public Administration, Diplomacy, and Citizenship, and of course the Newhouse School, the Journalism and Communications School. We can educate our students, the community, convene industry, people in politics, people in advocacy, bipartisan range of players to bring focus around these issues. They're just so interconnected. The health of democracy impacts the health of independent journalism, and the health of the journalism industry certainly impacts democratic governance.
When I look at who you're training at the Maxwell School, at the Newhouse School, and now in this institute, you're training future government officials, future media, and others. With the Trust Barometer, we find that of the four institutions we look at, government and media are the least trusted. Is there a way that there's a kind of fall together and maybe rise together thinking?
In the fall, the Trust Barometer is going to be one of the key tools we're using to teach the undergraduates in that first class about truly where Americans are at right now and where people around the world are at in terms of their trust of governments and of other institutions. As you know, there has been an overall slide in trust across essentially. There are a lot of factors for this, a lot of factors, but public understanding of how institutions work and of how the press works, really that component of public understanding is so vital to trust, because part of a measure of trust is performance, but part of a measure of trust is expectations and understanding what journalists do, how news gets made, how headlines are written, how facts are checked, how sources are verified, the difference between news and opinion, between reporting and columns, between a news program on TV and an entertainment program that talks about news issues. These are subtleties and nuances that most Americans don't go to journalism school. They don't sit around studying stuff like that. You're just a consumer. You're watching or reading and taking in information, and it's easy to blur the lines. I think the same is true in government and politics. I do think education and awareness are part of it. I also think there are a lot of other factors, including the proliferation of social media, including the decline of local news, and including active misinformation and disinformation campaigns.
So there's so much of that we're going to get into. So let me try to go almost a little bit back in order. You talked about people not understanding how media works. Am I right that at Harvard you even taught a class to non-media folks, helping them better understand how media works?
I teach a class each spring at the Kennedy School for graduate students, and I'll teach again in the spring of 2024, called Engaging the Media. And the goal of this course, and it really has helped inform a lot of my early thinking about the Institute here at Syracuse, the goal of that course was to create basically a media literacy and to some degree media training course for non-journalists. So if you are in government, if you're entering politics, if you are launching a startup, if you are a lawyer who does housing, if you're an educator, if you're a doctor or a nurse or a public health official trying to educate people during the pandemic about vaccinations or public safety, if you're in any of these realms, you have to understand how to interact with the media. And for many folks, either in college or in the military or in the sports world, especially young people, they're told by their bosses early on, don't talk to the media. You can't trust the media. And that is really a short-term strategy. That's not a viable long-term strategy if you want to be a thought leader or a brand leader, if you want to shape opinion, if you want to shape your own destiny. You have to be able to interact with the media. The question is which media and how, and what's the difference between different outlets and an interview versus a conversation. The idea of that course was to really say, let's demystify this and take some of the mystery out of it and understand this is how reporters think about stories. This is the ethical code of reporters. This is how editors and reporters and newsrooms work together. This is how source relationships work. Here's the difference between on the record and off the record and on background. And a lot of the stuff for folks listening to this might sound old hat because whether you're in journalism or whether you're in communications or PR or have worked in both worlds, you already know all of these contours. But most people, including highly educated people who are in business or in government, they don't know the intricacies of these relationships. And when your expectations are off or when it's a sort of a black hole and you're using your imagination to fill in the blanks, that's really when a lot of these kind of relationships can go wrong. So understanding what you and a journalist may have in common. The journalist is not necessarily there to help you. The journalist is there to tell the truth and share information with the public, but the journalist isn't necessarily against you either. Understanding those two roles and understanding the way the system works and how to speak most effectively, what the time constraints are, how to talk to a camera, how to do a Zoom interview, how to do an in-person interview. These are all sort of the building blocks of being able to communicate through the media.
Yeah, well, at a time when more people think that journalists are dividing forces than unifying forces, this sort of education is so important. It resonates to me because I find that even corporate executives want to engage with media when it's purely in their interests and don't take the time as much as they used to build trusting relationships with media, really get to know each other, better understand what the media is looking for beyond promoting their company. So, I feel like what you're preaching to the Harvard students is something that is actually useful well beyond the students that you're teaching.
A lot of CEOs that I've talked to will say that it is the crisis that forces them to rethink about their relationship with the media or how to build relationships with the media. The cardinal rule in sourcing, whether you're a reporter or whether you are on the other side of it, is that the best time to get to know someone is before you need them. And it's definitely before the crisis. And if we can help to educate students, not just in journalism or in public affairs, but here at the Syracuse Institute, if we can help to educate students who are entering careers in sports, in business, in entertainment, in the military about how those ecosystems work and how to navigate them. If you can start that understanding 20 years or 30 years before the crisis where you're forced to reconsider it, I think that can do a lot of good. It can do a lot of good individually, just for any person to understand how the media world works or how the government world works. But I think it can also do important things for society. I mean, the reality is just that you don't have to be a journalist or in government to understand the value of it. You are much better protected yourself against misinformation or spin, and you're much better able to bring your family, your workplace, your communities along to coexist peacefully in society and to understand changes that are happening if you have those basic literacies about how your democracy works and how the media works.
It's well known in terms of the erosion of local news. So maybe talk a little bit more around solutions and how to bring that local reporting. I know through Axios, this is also something you're very involved with.
Yeah, Axios for the last several years has been involved in building out local news in sort of moderate sized metro areas, largely through Axios Local. You can get Axios Local for free in cities around the country, just like you would get all the Axios national newsletters. There's Axios Chicago and Tampa and literally dozens of cities around the country. But the idea here, in part, is that we know that there is a real hunger at the local level for the kind of news that has atrophied greatly with the decline of local newspapers, both the outright death of local papers and just the atrophying of local papers. And I'm talking beyond politics about just what's happening in your city. New development, new spending, restaurant openings, community events, but also highlighting investigative work or doing some of the investigative work on their own. And I was just in Chicago very recently in August for a Syracuse program on food and democracy. And I brought in one of my colleagues from Axios, who co-writes the Axios local newsletter and is both a local news reporter, but also a food journalist, to talk about the intersection of food and democracy issues. And among our group, there was so much interest and input because there was a local journalist there as well as a local restaurant owner. And so people were able to talk at the really granular level. And by the end of the event, people were emailing me information about composting pilot projects and food pantry ways to participate and wanting to share that information with each other. And again, it is having that way for people in a community to talk to each other about things that they have in common as well as things that they have apart.
Yeah, well, also what I picked up in your story is that it was a trigger for local engagement as well. And certainly that seems to have happened out of an event. Is there a way that a more robust local news can get people more engaged in their community as well?
We do know that that's true. And unfortunately, we know it for sort of the downside consequences in the other direction as well, which is that scholars, this is over the course of the last decade and a half, last 2 decades, have been able to measure a decline in participation in community activities, civic groups, parent teacher associations, when local news declines in those areas. And we also have 2 great researchers at Syracuse at the Institute who I get to work with, Joanna Dunaway and Josh Dar. And Josh and Joanna have for years partnered on academic research around the connection between political polarization and local news, and have found a couple of really interesting threads that in places where local news has declined, there was a measurable decrease in split ticket voting. So it's more polarizing. And also that there's some evidence that local news coverage, including local opinion news coverage, helps strengthen communities. So you can actually measure these impacts. And there are an entire field of researchers, including Joanna and Josh, who have made this a big part of their life's work to understand those connections.
So let's talk more broadly about political polarization and polarization overall. You started the conversation around Syracuse about how January 6th became a galvanizing moment of the Institute, and it sounds like your involvement with it. Can you talk a little bit more about the connection and why the role that you are starting in is hopefully going to have a positive impact around polarization?
Well, I'll tell you about my story, and I don't want to conflate this with the Syracuse story. For me, I've been in reporting around 30 years. I covered local news in Florida and in California. I covered state government in both states as well, and then came back to Washington. I have certainly observed over the course of my career a real increase in polarization, both at the local level, at the national level, in just day-to-day engagement. And with it, a huge uptick in emphasis on political coverage. Like, I remember when I was covering politics in California and Governor Gray Davis was recalled and Arnold Schwarzenegger became the governor, thinking, well, this is crazy oddity of a story that will never be repeated again in American life. Was totally wrong about that. It was just a prelude, a very tame, actually, genteel prelude for some of the things that were to come. So for me, by the time January 6th rolled around, I already had been quite concerned about both political polarization, and I don't mean differences of opinion. People do not have to agree on things. Like, there's a long, robust tradition of political debate in this country. Unity does not mean that you all get on the same page engage and believe in the same thing. That's not what it means. It is that you agree on a set of facts and you essentially agree to disagree, that you can coexist, whether you're making laws together or living together, without your differences over politics burning the whole place down, right? So January 6th, where the pandemic has already started, everybody's working remotely. I am editing from my kitchen table and realize that I have not talked to either one of my reporters who are on the Hill for maybe an hour. And I've got someone in the House and someone in the Senate. And I'm starting to see things on Twitter and realize that I have no idea whether my reporters are okay or not, or where they are. Finally able to make contact with both. So for me, the kind of terror of that period of time where I honestly didn't know if my reporters were safe, and then trying to steer the news coverage both as a breaking story and a sort of story that was instant history, where you realize that a dam had broken in our country and something truly bad domestically, truly, truly bad had happened. Trying to make sense of that in the hours, the days, the weeks, the months after that really got me thinking that I cared a lot more about helping to be part of the solution. And it's very hard to do that in a daily breaking news environment where really your primary job is what is the story. And if you decide that you've become passionate about a part of that story, it's pretty hard to keep doing that. So I knew that I wanted some way to try to improve our understanding of democracy and journalism's role in it, but I really didn't know what. And when I learned about Syracuse's interest in launching this institute, it was exactly what I wanted to do. I just hadn't really known how to describe what I wanted to do yet. So what we are trying to stand up here is a combination of research. We talked about the research a little bit, teaching students, but also teaching the public and doing outreach programs to community colleges, to high schools, and also to companies. So research, teaching, some convening of industry groups, and also public events to engage people in Washington and people around the country to look at these issues, not just in like the obvious way, which is like elections and politics and newspapers and media, but in a much more intersectional way, where these challenges to democracy and to free speech and to the right to access accurate information are really cutting across AI, technology, entertainment, sports, which is a big area of emphasis educationally at Syracuse for us, healthcare, social issues. I mean, you name it. Every issue or area of interest to Americans today is its own kind of crucible for these issues around democratic governance, human rights, freedom of speech, and the right to get true information.
What is the role of corporations in terms of building the media literacy of their own employees?
If you're a corporation, your role is to have a successful business and make a profit. But there are many CEOs and companies that also care about the role they play in the community. And I know there are many executives who believe that peaceful and productive society where people can coexist, whether it's inside the company or inside their community, is really vital to the kind of stability that helps businesses have predictability and growth and longevity. So there is a business upside to people living peacefully and being well informed. Starting this fall, the Institute is going to launch our inaugural class, and it's going to be called Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship. And it really is a foundational education in all of the things that you and I have been talking about today: the erosion of trust, the polarization of media consumption, how that affects public attitudes and behavior, how misinformation and disinformation work, and how civic experiments underway now to help educate people about how government works and how journalism works, how those are taking root. The goal of this class is to educate people entering the workforce, whether they're in journalism or government or politics or in a completely different field. But my long-term goal with this course is to create a much shorter version that also is driven by a lot of the same visual information, the Edelman Trust Barometer, some of these other measurements where you can literally visualize the challenges to communicating to one America across all these different divisions. And to package that class, not just for students in college, but to package that class for adults in the workforce. And we are looking in the coming months and years to be working with corporations, large corporations and small businesses to develop this kind of both media literacy and civic literacy course in a very compact form, half an hour, that can be used for employee onboarding and for continuing education, because it's really important for students to learn, but this is also something that can be of real value to Americans individually and to the stability and sort of long-term harmony and success of companies.
You spoke about the terror that you felt on January 6th. The stat from the last year of the Trust Barometer that still blows my mind is that we found that only 30% of people would help someone if in need if they strongly disagreed with their point of view. And I'm curious, what gives you hope that there's a way of bridging this polarization?
I think that one of the most effective ways to change this dynamic is by bridging those divides, by engaging audiences and engaging with audiences that are polarized or disconnected. I know it's very hard to do that with 350 million people, but I think on a case-by-case basis, these engagements matter. I will tell you that when I was leading the White House Correspondents Association, I guess about 6 years ago, we did kind of a national listening tour where we went into different communities to just hear from Americans about what are their questions about White House coverage or about government coverage. What are the issues that they care about? If they had some time to talk to journalists, what would they want to tell them? And we did this partly in partnership with presidential libraries and museums. We did one event at the Truman Library. We did one event at the Reagan Library. And we did many other engagements outside of presidential libraries as well. And I learned a couple of interesting things. One is that when you had a chance to talk one-on-one with people after the event, they would very rarely want to talk about national politics. What they really wanted to talk about one-on-one were the challenges going on in their own communities. And that's why I say that I think the decline of local news has been so intertwined with both polarization and distrust in the media, because in the old days, when I got my start in newspapers, I was a local reporter in Plant City, Florida, and in Ventura County, California. And in both of those places, people would contact us to ask about literally like how to get something done in their school district or a problem they were having in their neighborhood or with a local official. As local news has declined, people don't know who to contact and they don't know reporters. They don't know reporters in a professional context and they don't know them socially, like the reporter who lives next door to me or the reporter who my kid goes to school with their kid. And so there's a real correlation between physical or emotional proximity to someone and how much you trust them. As you know, someone will light you up on Twitter or X or whatever it's called. But if you decide to reply, they'll be so embarrassed because you just have become a real person. They'll usually say, I'm really sorry. Thanks for responding. What I meant was. The other thing that I learned during our listening tour back then, it was just a really important reminder of how we take for granted the idea that people who are not reporters know how reporters work and think and how you get stories. Like, I'll give you a perfect example, anonymous sources. The whole idea of anonymous sources is pretty opaque by design, right? You're not sharing who the source is, but it's a minority, but there's a share of Americans who I would talk to who thought that anonymous sources meant that the reporter didn't know who the anonymous source was. And they would say, well, how can we trust the source if you don't even know who they are? And you're like, what? And then you realize they're not messing with me. They don't know. I mean, and how would they know if they'd never learned this before? And so it can help to have transparency in news where you have a section that says the source was granted anonymity because they're not authorized to talk about whatever. Even so, I think a lot of the public does not understand that the reporter knows who the source is. There's a standards process inside the newsroom. So 2 or 3 editors also know who the source is. You've had a discussion about how the source knows what they claim to know. You have sought to validate it some other way. There are a lot of journalism and civic experiments underway right now to try to expand that visibility about how news gets made and to foster more trust between readers and newsrooms, and one is a group called Trusting News, and there are several efforts underway. I think these are all really, really important, but it is a slow process. What gives me hope is that we are in the midst of a technological revolution that's on one hand terrifying. There's a lot of new ways to spread misinformation and disinformation, but it's also a reset for the way generationally that we consume news. And a lot of the efforts at increasing civic awareness and civility and bipartisanship or nonpartisanship or whatever, a lot of that has focused on the traditional delivery of news, right? Which is like, how do we deal with the bifurcated viewership of the three major cables or the major networks or whatever? But I have a stepdaughter who's 31 this year and a daughter who's 19 turning 20. And my stepdaughter still reads some traditional news, but not as much as my generation does. My 19-year-old reads basically none. She gets her news from YouTube, from TikTok, and from legit news sources that push into her phone. She does not go looking for it. She doesn't subscribe to stuff. I think in many ways that's really scary for people like me who are trying to figure out how to bring together communities around facts and systems and institutions. But I think in other ways, it's actually a great opportunity because there's a reset coming. Like, we're literally going over a cliff where nobody under the age of 30 is consuming news in a, quote, traditional way. And we have to rethink how we reach all of those people very quickly, baking in some of these transparencies and explanations about the process right now, I think could actually make a real generational difference.
That reset and rethink with the new generation just even further justifies how terrific it is that Syracuse has set up this institute and you're going to be running it. So very excited to see what you do with it. That's all we have time for today. Margaret, thank you for sharing your insights and expertise. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to The Trust Makers. If you enjoy the show, be sure to subscribe and consider taking some time to write a review. And if you're looking for more trust context and applications, subscribe to the Edelman Trust Institute's newsletter via the link in the show notes. We'll be back next time with more insights on how to build trust in today's society.
Thank you for tuning into The Trust Makers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.